Hello there, I'm Ellen Mauro on Capitol Hill with Capri Cafaro, a former Democratic leader of the Ohio State Senate and now a faculty member at American University here in Washington, D.C. And we are taking your questions on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube on the election results of the midterms from yesterday. Quite an election, Capri. I'll just start by asking you, yeah, exactly. What's your impression of what we saw in terms of a split Congress now?
I don't think it was really a surprise, given what we were seeing leading up to election night. We saw, a number of Democrats that were vulnerable on the United States Senate map. Mm-hmm. Pretty much everyone that every Democrat that voted against Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation for the Supreme Court lost yesterday evening. But then we saw where Democrats succeeded were in places in the House as well as in the Senate, in places like Nevada, for example. Those were states where there is a growing diversity in those populations, areas that have a higher educational attainment, as well as Hispanic, Latino communities, and a growing younger population, conversely to places like Indiana, where Joe Donnelly lost, which is traditionally more white and older, for example.
And we're getting questions in on Twitter. If I'm looking at my phone, it's because I'm getting your questions sent to me here. This comes from Blair Kerrigan on Twitter. What do you feel will be the Democrats' priorities moving forward with their House majority? What do you feel should be their priorities?
Okay, well, I'll start with actually what should be their priorities. I actually did a piece today online about this because I think that this is an incredible opportunity for Democrats to actually lead. Yes, we will have divided government because we have a Republican Senate and a Democratic House, but there are actually areas in which I think Democrats and Republicans can work together, and that's where we should start. For example, Democrats and Republicans both have said that they're willing to entertain making the middle class tax cuts permanent. That would be a fantastic place to start. Infrastructure is an area where there's usually been bipartisan cooperation, investing in roads and bridges and water and sewer projects. And another thing that I would mention is the issue of covering pre-existing conditions. Mm-hmm. Here in the United States, you know that our system is somewhat different, although not nearly as different as you may think from the Canadian system. And that area of pre-existing conditions became a very big issue at the end of the 2018 midterm election. And Republicans said repeatedly they wanted to protect pre-existing conditions. That's a place where Republicans and Democrats can work together as well. So I hope that's where they go.
Was that a campaign strategy on the part of the Republicans, do you think, though?
Yeah, I think, yes, it was. But I think, again, if Democrats and Republicans want to show that they are willing to end this divisive climate, which remains to be seen. These are areas where, if it was a talking point, that's unfortunate, but they need to show the American people it wasn't.
Mm-hmm. Yes. This is coming from Leo Baduria on Facebook. Will there be a runoff election in Georgia?
No. So that's a very good question, because obviously you are following the news, and Georgia is a state where you have to have 50+1. Basically in order to win, for there not to be a runoff. However, so it looked as if essentially that was not going to happen, and Stacey Abrams lost, but we are hearing actually that Stacey Abrams has not conceded. So who knows, that there may be some additional drama there. In addition, one other thing to look at, Bill Nelson in Florida that was running for United States Senate, he supposedly was ready to concede down there, but I just heard on the way over here that apparently he may not concede. So more drama in the state of Florida too.
I just want to go back to Stacey Abrams, because obviously if she were to have won, she would have been the first African-American female governor. But more broadly last night, we saw a lot more diversity in terms of the people who were elected. Can you talk a little bit about what we've seen in terms of Muslim women? And
yeah, I mean, this was really, and I think this goes back to, and it roots to some of the issues that we saw coming out of the 2016 election. We saw a record number of women and people of color and the LGBT community stepping up and saying that they wanted to run, partially, motivated by, some of the concerns they had around President Trump's agenda. Mm-hmm. What we did see last night was now we have over 100 women members of Congress. That includes Democrats and Republicans. Most of the first came out of the Democratic Party, although I will say there was the first Korean American woman who is a Republican that was elected last night to Congress. We also have 2 Muslim American women, one from Minnesota and one from Michigan. Those are traditionally more Muslim, concentrated populations. Mm-hmm. And then we have the first LGBT out governor, and as well as, I believe, 2 members of Congress as well coming, and 2 Native American women, which is the first as well.
So a great night for diversity.
Absolutely.
Last night. Going back to the issue of bipartisanship, and obviously that's going to be a major concern going forward.
No question.
How heavily do you think the Trump factor weighs on the ability for there to be bipartisanship in Congress and with the White House?
I mean, it's going to cut both ways. I mean, I think that President Trump will continue to be President Trump. He is going to continue to say what he wants to say, use the language he wants to use. And I think particularly because of the victories in the United States Senate, I think that to President Trump, I think he sees that as an affirmation that his strategy works, at least, to some extent. So I think he's going to continue on his way, and I think that if the Democrats do things like impeachment proceedings or spend a lot of time on hearings and investigations, that will be a foil to President Trump to say, look, Democrats are obstructionists, they're out to get me, and then it totally devolves. So hopefully somebody has to come to the table and show that they're willing to govern, and I think that it is incumbent upon the Democrats to do so, but the Republicans need to come to the table too.
Just a reminder, we are taking your questions on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. So if you have any questions for Capri or myself, please put them in the comments below and we will get them. I'll get them here on my phone. But going back to President Trump, he's having a press conference at 11:30.
Right.
So far on Twitter, he's pointed to this as being a victory for him and the Republicans. And in a way, in the Senate, it is a victory.
Right.
What do you think we're going to hear from him at 11:30?
Well, I think we're going to hear just that. I think we're going to hear about how this is a tremendous night for Republicans, that it shows that his agenda is working, that that the American people are supporting those things, that it was right to confirm Brett Kavanaugh, for example, and that all the places that he went to campaign were places that those, particularly those Senate and gubernatorial candidates were by and large victorious. So, I mean, for no question about it, I mean, it was a mixed bag last night, and I think because it was not an absolute blowout for Democrats, President Trump is taking a victory lap. And honestly, even in a lot of the seats where Democrats were able to pick them up, so many of these seats were by razor-thin margins, and I think that's reflective of the consistent and continued divided electorate that we have here.
What happened to the blue wave? I mean, it's maybe a bit more of a blue ripple,
Right.
in the words of Sarah Sanders, but why don't you think that there was more of the blue wave that had been predicted several months ago?
Right. I never actually believed in the blue wave, to be honest. I mean, simply, I think partially because I'm from Ohio, a state that has, traditionally been, a swing state, more blue collar, Rust Belt, and really was the heart of places where Democrats voted for Donald Trump. So in places like Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, which I will say, 3 of the 4 of those actually elected Democratic governors, but usually they elect every place but Ohio usually has had Democratic governors, historically, so that's not necessarily shocking. But, the thing is that what has happened is that the demographics have changed, and the electoral map has changed. So Democrats are becoming less and less competitive in the middle of the country, places that, again, are older, whiter, may be less educated in certain circumstances. And then conversely, they're becoming more competitive in some of the Sun Belt states like Arizona, Nevada, places like Virginia, and even Florida, and frankly Texas. Beto O'Rourke, they got a lot of attention. People thought he was going to lose by about 8 points. Came in about 2 or 3 under Ted Cruz, which is significant given how deep red the state of Texas is.
Right. We talked about women getting elected and this being a good year for diversity. What about the importance of female voters? For example, yesterday we were in the Virginia 10th, and female voters in suburban areas, the analysis is they turned away from some of the messages from Donald Trump and the Republicans, and that they were a big factor. So how big of a factor were female voters in this election?
I think in the places where Democrats won, I think that they were a significant factor there. And here's why, again, we're looking at seats that were targeted that basically were won by Hillary Clinton in 2016. So those suburban women were already, they may have voted previously for that Republican member of Congress, but they were not voting for Donald Trump. They did not support Donald Trump. So that translated into voting for a Democrat this time around as a check and balance. So, I think that women did step up in those areas, but this is, more traditionally majority. I think, again, two groups, essentially, minority women and college-educated women, and obviously an overlap there as well, that helped put Democrats over the edge in a number of these congressional seats specifically.
We are getting a few questions coming in now on Facebook and YouTube and Twitter. This one from ASMR Moments on YouTube is asking, with the majority of the House, can the American president be impeached now? And it's a little bit more complicated than that.
No, I mean, because ultimately it still has to go to the Senate. So I mean, it's unlikely, let me put it this way too, it is unlikely, even with a Democratic majority in the House, that if they try to do impeachment proceedings at all, because I think that there is a recognition that politically that is bad, that it sets up President Trump very well to use them, as I said earlier, as a foil, but it is unlikely that they would be able to bring articles of impeachment, go through that whole process, bring it to the Senate, and actually be able to remove him from office, and again, particularly because of what's happening. Because it's a divided government.
And we saw in the campaign that many Democrats were very hesitant to kind of go there when they were asked.
Well, and you have to remember, there are a lot of places across the country where Democrats were trying to compete in places where President Trump won. Especially at the state level, but at the congressional level as well. And so they really tried in places like Kentucky to distance themselves, in places like Ohio to distance themselves from both Nancy Pelosi and sort of the Democratic establishment in Washington, but also to be very careful not to alienate the Trump voter because they were part of that coalition.
We have a question now from Linda Marie Drossi on Facebook. She's asking about the amount of races that are still not decided. Have they looked at the allegations of voting machine malfunctions? Will this overturn any of the decided seats?
I can't speak to that definitively.
Yeah.
But I mean, the issue, I think, in Georgia specifically, because there have been allegations about the gubernatorial candidate that is also the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State has jurisdiction over election functionality in most states, and certainly in the case in Georgia. I've also, again, back to Bill Nelson, it looks as if they may be looking for a recount there. And there may be some issues out in Arizona with Kristen Sinema and Martha McSally, although I think at this point the margin between those two is large enough. Interestingly, the Green Party candidate out there in the Arizona Senate race got more votes than the distance between Martha McSally and Kristen Sinema, which says something about the impact of third-party candidates here. But we always have to be very careful about not only election security, and and we'll hear a lot about election meddling too, which I do want to say there is a distinct difference between trying to influence through things like fake Facebook accounts or Twitter accounts or that sort of thing, and actually hacking into voting machines. They're two very different things. Generally speaking, we have a pretty secure election system, but not every. I'll tell you, in my home state of Ohio, we had a bunch of power outages yesterday at a number of polling locations across the state. So.
Well, it was interesting. The station where we were at in Virginia yesterday, they had one vote counting machine because they have paper ballots. They put the ballots in the machine. It broke because it was raining in Virginia yesterday. People were coming in wet. Their ballot papers were getting wet.
Sticky.
Went into the machine, broke the machine. Thankfully, it got up and running. But the officers there were quite panicked, obviously.
Of course.
Going back to Georgia, which you were speaking about a few minutes ago, from Leo Baduria, what happens if Abrams does not concede due to possible vote counting problems?
Well, I think I might have just answered that question. I mean, it sounds as if she's not conceding from the most recent accounts that I have heard just this morning. And I think that, what's going to end up happening, and this is where the rub is that it really is going to have to be down to individual boards of elections. And there's a lot of court proceedings. They would probably have to file a motion to say we want to have a recount. Some states have specific laws about how the margin that would have an automatic trigger of a recount as well. So there's a number of different factors that go into that. So even if they want one, they may not necessarily get one. But they can certainly try.
This is a question from Fitz Tastico on YouTube talking about Bob Menendez, a senator from New Jersey. He says, I worry that Bob Menendez being reelected is a bad look for Democrats, looking hypocritical as they investigate corruption in Trump when Menendez has his own history with it. What is your take on that?
Take it up with the voters of New Jersey. I mean, this is the challenge of representative democracy. Certainly, Bob Menendez, has history of corruption with the trial that he endured, but we obviously have a judicial system here that he went through, and that is what that is, and he made it through the judicial process, and the people of New Jersey chose to elect him, no different than the people of California chose to elect a couple members of Congress that were also under investigation, as well as one up in New York that is under criminal indictment too. So I think it does show all politics is local, but I agree that I think one of the questions maybe that Democratic leadership in the Senate need to ask themselves is, would that impact Senator Menendez's committee assignments in the next Congress because of some of the scandals surrounding him? And is that fair because he was duly elected by the people and, basically acquitted?
And this is a question from Ian Carter on Facebook. How would you describe the mood of the country this morning?
Confused. I think confused, and I think still uneasy. I think there's a lot of Democrats that feel that even though that we picked up the House, that this isn't quote unquote solving anything. I mean, and I tend to agree that we're not going to see anything change when it comes to the functionality of government. We already have gridlock, and we had gridlock within, one party rule with Republicans controlling the entire Congress as well as the White House. So I don't think we're going to see any, improvement in the functionality and gridlock here inside the Beltway on Capitol Hill. But I think that the American public is torn. I think they see some hope and opportunity that there might be some movement. For those that are not fans of President Trump, I think they're trying to be optimistic. And I say on the flip side, for those that are fans of President Trump, trying to be optimistic with the victories in the United States Senate. I will add one more thing, and I think this might be another reason why Democrats are a little bit torn right now. The power that lies in the United States Senate is so significant, and in some ways more significant than the House, because of their ability to advise and consent, meaning that they can, confirm the appointees of President Trump, federal judges, Supreme Court judges, members of the cabinet, and those kind of things. And so with picking up 4 seats and having a larger margin where they don't have to bring in the vice president to break a tie, which is what we do here because of the, he also serves as the president of the Senate, that gives President Trump more power, not less.
And we saw how important the Senate was with the Judge Kavanaugh, now Justice Kavanaugh vote, and some of the new Republican senators are even further to the right. So what we've seen in the past is Lisa Collins and Lisa Murkowski, I should say, they're more moderate Republicans, so their votes have mattered. They've had to kind of temper things. Those votes don't matter so much anymore.
Exactly, because it is no longer 51-49. They're not necessarily going to have to negotiate as much with the more moderate members of the Republican caucus, which, and I will say this, while more women have been elected in this cycle, there's actually been a loss of Republican women. And that's unfortunate in the sense that, much like Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, while they are still here, women just in general tend to be more in line to compromise and be open-minded to solutions. And with less women on the Republican side, I think it might be even more difficult to strike some balance.
Getting a question from Master Onion North on YouTube. Any numbers yet as to how many young people voted and the total numbers for voters overall for the midterms?
I will have to look, but I can tell you one number off the top of my head, and that is the early voting number, which significantly eclipsed the numbers in 2014 in midterm elections. So traditionally speaking, in midterm elections, when the president is not on the ballot, we have much lower voter participation. And Democrats actually usually have less voter participation than Republicans in midterm elections. In some states, there are about 33 states that allow individuals to vote early. Without having to be out of the state or anything like that. And a lot of Americans are now taking advantage of that. What we saw was 35 million votes cast early across the country in these 33 states. That is 15 million votes more than 2014 and not much less than was cast in the 2016 presidential election. So I think that's reflective of the enthusiasm. I haven't seen the numbers specifically for 18 to 29, but I'm sure that at least in some parts of the country, and I would surmise, and particularly in places where Democrats won, I would bet that there's a pretty high youth participation.
And we can speak to my camera woman and I, Patty, we were at the Virginia 10th district yesterday in Sterling, Virginia, and they had much higher numbers than even what they had in 2016 for the presidential election. So that speaks to, just the excitement that there was surrounding this midterm. Sandra Greaves on Facebook, are more of the newly elected candidates in support of protecting the environment? It's a bit of a toughie.
Well, again, I would say that, like, for example, when you are looking at some of the members that are coming from places like New Mexico, Idaho, and even places like Kansas, for example, that have more of a, and even on the East Coast, when you're looking at places like Pennsylvania, Virginia, as well as the far Northeast. You typically do have more of a history of commitment to environmental protection and stewardship. I can't necessarily say that it's going to necessarily be the same case in the United States Senate. I think there's a lot of folks out there, Republicans in particular, that have position themselves as being anti-regulation, and sometimes anti-regulation also translates into less environmental protections for manufacturing, for example. And of course, there continues to be the debate surrounding climate change, which I sincerely doubt, even with a Democratic majority in the House, is going to get any kind of traction in the next Congress.
No, that's
sadly,
right.
in my humble opinion.
President Trump himself is, he's very ambivalent, vague, sometimes a climate change denier.
Right. Well,
so that
and he still has the authority there because, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Interior, the Department of Education, all of these things are under the purview of the President of the United States. So he is able to choose the staff. He is able to sort of set the direction and the tone for those agencies that ultimately make the regulations. Certainly lawmakers make laws, but the executive branch has significant power to shape things, and the executive branch and President Trump still have the ability to do things like pull out of accords, like we saw with Paris, like we've seen within the United Nations as well.
This is going to be our last question, and it seems like a good one to end on. From Big Eyes on YouTube, considering how tumultuous and controversial Trump's era has been, are Americans concerned that the tribal dedication to Trump will endure in spite of any poor or at times even shocking behavior from the president?
I think we probably can say, it's safe to say that up to this point, for the base of Trump supporters have stayed with him regardless of what he has said and done. Whether it is, the incendiary remarks about women, all the way back to, the campaign, to making disparaging remarks about African Americans, and creating a lot of fervor surrounding immigration and equating immigrants to criminals, and there was a lot of things that would give pause in preview to anybody else that would have been president. And I think especially after the two incidents, unfortunately, that we had recently with the bomber individual that tried to send bombs all across the country to prominent Democrats and as well as media outlets, and then the tragedy of the Jewish community in Pittsburgh. The assumption is that the American president, any leader, and I think you would say this for Trudeau, who is, like any world leader, if there's a tragedy in your country, they come forward and they try to unify the country. They try to be the comforter in chief, as we say. And we did not see that in the wake of those incidences with President Trump. We saw, a blame of the media and, a continued combative nature, and obviously, it was not a huge blue wave, and they still picked up seats in the United States Senate. So I think that what we're going to see is people that are with Trump are with Trump, and that's it.
He doesn't have the nickname Teflon Don for nothing.
You said it.
Well, thank you very much for your questions on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, and thank you, Capri, for all of your thoughts and sharing them with our audience.
Thank you for having me.
For more on the midterms, keep watching CBC News. Thanks. Should be done in just a sec.
No problem.